Welcome to another episode of Something Simple and Light with Tolu, Alao. On this episode, we continue our discussion on supply chain mastery, and we're going to look at strategic sourcing, logistics, and distribution. Let's start with strategic sourcing. With strategic sourcing, we understand that Nigeria is such a remarkable country where a lot of the items that are produced, are dependent on sourcing things, from other countries, internationally, globally. And what we're beginning to see with the rising cost of things, exchange rates, naira devaluation, and all of that, it's becoming increasingly expensive to depend on this internationally sourced materials. Now, the imperative for most businesses are beginning to ask themselves, are there local alternatives to what we use, right? Can we source locally? And this is where strategic sourcing comes into play. How do we source our raw materials? Because going downstream from manufacturing, supplies, deliveries, logistics, and all of that, it depends on what you get as raw materials. If I have to get expensive raw materials, it doesn't matter how efficient your operations are, the final product will be remarkably more expensive, right? And this is why businesses are beginning to ask themselves, can we get these raw materials locally? In fact, there is a word that was coined and I really like because it speaks directly to this, and it's called resource-based industrialization. And in resource-based industrialization basically is industrializing your country or producing items that you have resources for naturally, right? So whether it's crude oil that we naturally have in Nigeria, or palm kernel from palm oil, or cocoa, for chocolates, or rubber, right, or textile. These are things, or even steel, iron ore. These are items that we have locally that we can manufacture, right? It doesn't make any, operational sense if you try to produce or manufacture things that you have to import the raw materials for. You will definitely not be competitive with countries that have these raw materials and are just, producing from what they have. So strategic sourcing speaks effectively to sourcing in such a way that you are playing to your strengths, right? How can I source for items that are used in my supply chains from a local perspective? Right. And while I understand the arguments that, people have that, Nigerians want certain things, and, if the market wants something, right, they will probably pay for it if they want it by all means, right? It doesn't, build a sustainable economy if we continue to produce things that we do not have the local, competence or local, competitive advantage. That's the word, right? Competitive advantage to produce. So you want a situation where we're getting our leverage, we're able to compete globally because we are playing to our strengths, right? And this is what strategic sourcing is about. Are there local players? Do we have local partners? Can we build relationships, right? And move beyond just having transactions, right? So can we build relationships with local players, to produce these items, right? To collaborate with them. If there's some form of investment that is required to mechanize the process, right? For production, collaborating with farmers to go into large scale farming, right? Because for industrialization to happen, it needs to happen at scale, right? So we're not just looking at small scale farmers, farming one plot of land, two plots of land. We're looking for acres, right? We have acres of land that are producing raw materials that can now be used at scale, right? And this is something that is very, very critical. So that's the first pillar of our discussion today, strategic sourcing, right? The next part of this is logistics, right? And I know that at the beginning of this season, I spoke a bit about infrastructure, right? Because this ties so closely with logistics, right? If you don't have the right infrastructure for your logistics network to be efficient, right? Whether it's rail system, whether it's a highway that works, whether it's by sea, seaports, right? The logistics system, even down to the last mile, ensuring that every part of the system, every part of the network gets the materials that they need, right, for production, for manufacturing, for consumers, right? This is something that you critically need to look at. And one of the things that is currently being done by businesses is looking for ways to build distribution centers, or have these warehouses where you can reduce the volume of items that are required to move to every single location, right? Because it's more efficient to move a few 30-ton trucks than moving 50 kg items many times. So if I was to move 100 tons, for instance, with a 30-ton truck, I'm just going to do that about 3 times, right? 3.5 times, or even 4 times if I do 120, right? Versus having to, do that with a smaller vehicle because I have smaller orders. So we're able to consolidate all those orders and, load those volumes in those hubs, in those distribution hubs, and then that is distributed, right? And another area here is also partnering with third-party logistics companies to have these items delivered, to the end users. This can be very, very, very instrumental to remaining competitive. So you do not have to own all the infrastructure. You do not have to own all the vehicles, the fleets, be responsible for maintenance, and all of that, right, for every single item that is delivered. So obviously, yes, there are locations that are very close to your production site, so where your items are produced, where it makes sense to deliver yourself or even for the customer to pick up, right? But when you start thinking about on a national level, right, you will not necessarily have to, have all the items for that.